There were towns and cities that banned the playing of Rebel Without a Cause. The community standards were such that they felt their community was at risk. And if you show a film to a teenage audience where there's a switchblade fight, they were saying, you're asking for trouble.
Rebel was a shocker because of the sociological implications of kids behaving the way they were in the film. But it goes farther than that. It was just so well conceived, the idea of these kids being that lost and separated from society, making their own society and their own family. When you saw it on the screen, the impact, I thought, was very, very great.
Nick had felt passionate about a discovery that really he was one of the first to make, and that was that the kind of delinquency we were seeing among young people wasn't restricted to what was then called the ghetto. There was a lot of restlessness among middle-class young people who were acting out in ways that one would never expect. And he realized that this was a function of the family, not a function of an economic situation at all. It was their own rage at being raised by people whose values were old-fashioned to them, and at the kind of parenting that young people were experiencing in the wake of World War II. Explanations had to be found, and that this was certainly food for Hollywood.
There was this property at Warner Brothers called Rebel Without a Cause,
which was a book by a psychiatrist named Robert Lindner that had nothing to do with this, but was the day-by-day psychoanalysis, one part of it at least, of a young prisoner.
When Ray went to see Trilling at the studio, Trilling assumed that Ray was going to do the film based on Robert Lindner's book. And Ray said, no, I want to make a film about the normal kid who lives next door who is about to explode. And Trilling said, everybody knows that all delinquents come from poor homes. They come from poverty. These kids go to good schools. These kids have good families. They wouldn't turn to crime. And Ray said, well, I can't explain it. All I can do is tell you what I've read in the newspapers and in magazines and in talking to kids and cops and adults.
And he had found that on Mulholland Drive, there was a tunnel, and that at night, various groups of these kids would dare each other to race through the tunnel at each other. And the first one to pull out of the line of approach was Chicken.
He wrote a 17-page treatment, which he called The Blind Run. The treatment opens up with 3 vignettes, violent vignettes. One is of a boy setting a man on fire and then watching him burn. Another is of, I guess, 2 boys beating a girl with a whip. And the third is a blind run. There's 2 cars coming at each other inside a tunnel. And he presented it to Warner Brothers, and then they turned around and called it Rebel Without a Cause and not The Blind Run. And he was very upset about that. Nick Ray's first attempt to get a screenwriter was Clifford Odets. Clifford Odets was a friend of Ray's, and he trusted Odets' instincts as a writer. And the studio said, well, okay, that's fine, but we really have our own writer already, and his name is Leon Uris. He's written Battle Cry. Battle Cry is doing fabulously well. But then he and Uris could not agree on the concept of the film. Uris saw this macro picture. He saw communities at risk rather than individuals. Ray saw the film as a character study. The studio then made a second choice for Ray, again, not his own choice, and that was Irving Shulman. And Shulman came into the project without preconceptions, but somewhere along the way they had disagreements over the final planetarium sequence. Ray had a feeling that he wanted a sense of classical tragedy about the story, that there should be symbolic qualities to the scenes at the planetarium. Shulman insisted that the planetarium sequence was just a setting. So, okay, now you've got 2 writers. You haven't gotten along with either one of them. You're now about 4 months into pre-production for the film. you haven't got a finished script, enter Stuart Stern.
I went to a party at Gene Kelly's and Nick Ray was a guest.
Ray remembered a film called Teresa, which had been directed by Fred Zinnemann, and Stern had been nominated for an Oscar for his writing in that film. Ray admired the film for the way the characters were portrayed.
Being with Fred, who had a gift for empathizing with people from a different background and getting them to talk and seeing the wealth of story that came out of life, taught me everything that I ever needed as a writer. In looking at what Irving had done, those are not people I would have written, because I think almost everything I've written has been autobiographical. If I can't respond to material, it means it's not for me. And neither was his script. I think it was extremely competent, but it was not, I was nowhere in it. Nick sensed that, knew that, we talked about that. And he said, you've got to write your script, and I've got to make my picture. He had terrible pangs of conscience about himself as a father. And I had terrible fury about myself as a son. And we both knew that that was a stream that we both shared in different ways.
What's the matter with you anyhow?
He's just loaded, honey.
I was talking to Jim.
My mother really was never content with anything, and that there was really nothing Dad could do that could win her, because she could not give him love. He fell into that role of being a placater, idolizing her, adoring her. As he said to me once, my life has been a series of insults.
She eats him alive and he takes it.
He did put her apron on one night. These things just, they pop out of your own dramatization of what it was like for you.
Don't.
I'm in there like glue in every scene. I'm both Plato and Jim. I had never acted out the way Jim Stark acted out. I had wanted to, but I had had heroes. I don't know what I would have done without a model to cling to. And there were others who used me. And Rebel was like that to me. Plato, in my mind, was the starving orphan.
If only you could have been my dad.
You flipped or something.
Who needed to be sure there would be a father and a mother there that would protect him.
You know what he wanted? What? He tried to make us his family.
And then I felt that Jim, being fatherless, would have the same search. He was searching for his father to stand up.
You better give me something fast.
I think Buzz saw in this new kid what he was, and that this knife fight was a ritual of that. But there had to be a moment where they came clean. And that was my favorite scene that I've ever written.
You know something? I like you. You know that?
Why do we do this?
You gotta do something. Now, don't you?
It's a private moment in time away from his collected adorers who were just as needy as he was, but he couldn't show it. That's the plight of the hero. Peter Pan lives again in Rebel. When we decided that they would run away to a place that was an ideal, they arrive at Neverland, where there was mystery and privacy, but a million doors. And Plato's The Lost Boys.
Jim, it's me.
So it's Peter, Wendy, and the Lost Boys. And I said, it's going to be operatic. These are not going to be realistic scenes. And Nick said, well, that's what it is. It's opera when you're that old. And then the idea of rounding it, having the symmetry, of an early sequence at the planetarium in which the whole subject of the unimportance of man and of man existing alone and this whole story being about children existing alone and having to find each other. And will the world end at night or at dawn? And I knew right away that it was going to be 24 hours. It would start ending at night, but it would not end until dawn.
Boy, this is going to be one terrific day.
And Nick said, that's really tight.
Because tomorrow you'll be nothing.
He said, that's right. When you're a kid, he said, it can be a whole life that happens in 24 hours. The minute I saw the Griffith Observatory, I knew that it was meant for cosmic viewing.
We'll look into the night sky
but also that it was the nearest we could get to God. And the building is an echo of the stage house in the Greek amphitheater, in the Theater Dionysus in Athens, where those great playwrights wrote Oedipus and the Aeschylean trilogy and so on. That the sacrifice would be where the great tragedies were staged, on the temple steps. Originally, I had both of them killed. First they nab Plato, and as Jimmy starts toward Plato, they nab him. And they thought it was downbeat. So what do?
Nick Ray was trained to be an architect. He was a protege of Frank Lloyd Wright. And that was probably the field he would have gone into if he were not fascinated by the theater. He loved the theater, first as an actor, then as a writer. And in the 30s, he worked with a theatrical group called the Group Theater in New York City, which was a kind of a radical left-wing kind of a group. There he met Elia Kazan. While they were screening East of Eden, Nicholas Ray was there by invitation of Elia Kazan, and over in the corner was James Dean. He watched Dean in the film play Cal Trask, and then he would look back at the real James Dean, and it was like, this can't be the same guy. And that's when actually Nicholas Ray met James Dean.
I had heard of Jimmy Dean in New York and heard that he was bad news.
When Stern met Dean, it was at the home of Stern's cousin Arthur Lowe. Dean was a very reclusive person. He was very difficult to get to at first. He needed to kind of warm up to you.
We sat like stones until I think it was he who started first, imitating a cow, and I began, and he began. And then we imitated every animal and just started laughing. Then it was easy. Then we just talked about whatever we talked about. And he didn't have any teeth. He always wore a bridge in front because he'd fallen out of the barn loft as a kid and broken his front teeth.
Hey, stop!
Natalie Wood was looking for a role that would get her out of adolescent roles and into adult roles.
Oh, that's a new disease.
Man, a friend of yours?
Natalie understood that Ray was looking for a bad girl.
She would kill for this role, you know, and she went to Jack Warner about it, and she went to Nick about it.
There's a wonderful story about her, Faye Newell, and Dennis Hopper being in a car accident and calling Nick Ray, not her parents, but Nick Ray, to come down to the hospital to see her. So Nick Ray went down to the hospital, and here's Natalie on a stretcher with a possible concussion. Points down the hall to a doctor and says, "You see that son of a bitch? He called me a juvenile delinquent. Now do I get the part?"
She felt a little insecure with Jimmy, I think. She respected his ability, and she was thrilled to be able to work with someone so in touch with his feelings.
And interestingly enough, that was the place where Natalie felt weakest, because she had never studied. She wasn't a New York actress, but she sure knew the movie business and knew what the character was. She really knew that character very well.
Yeah. Yeah, he's my best friend.
Sal Mineo had been in a film called Six Bridges to Cross, but other than that, he had no major film experience. His chemistry with Dean was so good that I don't think Ray could choose anybody else. And one of the things that Ray was trying for was to surround Dean with as many sympathetic people as possible.
Mom and Dad. Now that I don't have them anymore, I wish I never had run away.
As a more or less family substitute, they had found one another. And there were three actors who also had experienced the loss of family or the frustration of not being able to reach out and touch family, especially in Jimmy's and Natalie's case. His was a lost family, the loss of his mother, the distance of his father.
Crunch, line him up.
Go all the way up together, get your cars, and bring them up on the right-hand side. Take your car.
I mean, I worked in movies since I was a kid, but I was just doing it because I lived in Hollywood, you know? I went to the University of Oregon on a football scholarship. I came home for a Christmas vacation, and my agent sends me on this interview at Warner Brothers.
Frank was actually in a gang called the Athenians at Hollywood High School.
Hollywood was our turf, basically. So there would be a lot of guys would come from different parts of the city, and if you're walking down the street or Hollywood Boulevard with your Athenian jacket on, there was a lot of confrontation that went down. It's funny, I mean, we weren't a gang per se. We were a social club. But I mean, the guys in our club could stand up against anybody. I mean, that's what the uniqueness of the Athenians were. And when I get out there, the casting director doesn't want me to go up and see Nick because I had a bad reputation.
One of the reasons that Ray had put him in the picture was because he really liked his attitude. And he knew the kinds of things that the actors didn't know about delinquents, how they spoke, how they used knives in a switchblade fight.
Just a little jabbing, that's all.
Frank was a street kid. I was scared of him. Frank, if you didn't know that, I'm telling you. I was doing a little theater in Hollywood, and Nick saw me in a show. Next day, my agent called and said, "We want to see Corey Allen at the studio."
Anywhere between 300 to 500 young actors showed up to go through this mass audition.
So they asked us to bring our own cars. It was on the back lot at Warner Brothers, and there must have been 20 to 30 kids in the scene. Car drives up, this actor that grabbed me and said, "We're supposed to fight." So we fought, and some cars were smashed, some people were really hurt, and then Nick said, "Cut," and that was that. And I remember I said to Frank one day, "You know, gee, I'd love to see that stuff." And he said, "There wasn't any film in the camera."
I remember we did different improvisations to just get us, you know, a feel for who was who.
Night after night on that old platform they had in the parking lot, working with one hot floodlight, putting these kids to the test to see who would function together as a real gang.
One of the things that Ray wanted them to do was to play King of the Hill.
He laid out the improv, and I saw guys going around and guys plowing into him, and I was throwing the ball at him or whatever. Frank Mazzola got all head up as his character, and he took after me, and I found myself on the ground face down with everybody on top of me.
But the one probably that sticks out the most in my mind is the thing that where Corey and I almost got into a real fight. Corey had a big ego in those days. And I did too. Well, we had a couple of situations. I mean, at the beginning of the film, when we were sitting on a wall, and Corey kind of kicked me, like, "Frank, would you move over?" And I said, "Wait a second, man. You just kicked me." You know? And he said, "Yeah, just move over." And I just blew it. And I went, and Don Page saw it because I think Nick was having Don keep an eye on me, you know, who was the assistant director on the show. And I remember Don pulling me aside, and I was so freaked out, you know, that he did that I was actually, I remember I had tears in my eyes because I wanted to get back. I was like seething, you know. And there was another incident where there was a girl that went to Hollywood High School that was a very dear friend of mine. And we were talking, Corey came up, you know, like he was interested in her, and he says, "You know, why don't you come with me? I want to talk to you," you know. I'm saying, "Excuse me," you know. And you know, then he says, yeah, well, you know, it's like I'm gonna talk. And again, I said, man, don't, you know. Then it became heated again because he kept triggering me, you know. But eventually we became great friends.
And then Nick got all of us together, everybody he thought would be in the film, for what they called the wardrobe tests. And they weren't really wardrobe tests because none of us except Jimmy and Corey ended up wearing what we have in those black and white tests. So it was more to see if we went with Jimmy and how we all looked together.
And when we did the wardrobe test, I said to myself, they're going to put me on film today, and I'm scared. And I'd had all these thoughts running around in my head.
You can't even see me because I'm in the background sulking. Then you hear Nick saying, hey, Frank, you know, would you mind coming up here or something like that? And I remember, man, if he says anything, if Corey says anything, I was thinking, I don't care about this show. If he says, you better not say anything. I mean, that was that kind of over the edge, you know.
But one thing I knew going to the studio was it's okay to be scared. It's not comfortable, but it's okay. Don't hide it. If you lie about it, you're more scared.
And if you look at the shot, I never look at Corey. I'm looking straight ahead. And if you look at Jimmy, Jimmy's going, you know, like this, and he's kind of, and then he does that thing where he puts his arm over my shoulder and puts his hand over my eyes. And that's a great moment.
Kids would say to me, this is after about 10 years later, they said, man, you look so cool. And they would ask me, how'd you do that? I didn't do anything.
Nick got all of us together for a reading of the script at his bungalow A at Chateau Marmont.
Nick said, what do you think about the film? And, you know, I said, well, some of it's kind of phony. And Jimmy kind of broke into a laugh. It was like a kind of an immediate bonding because I was being honest. So he said, well, you know, what's funny about it, you know? And I said, well, the gang just seems a little strange. Some of the dialogue and the cars they're driving and some of the clothes, and it just seemed like it wasn't, you know, what was really going on at the time. I remember Nick said, can you prove that? So what I did is I called an Athenian meeting. So we're going to meet this gang down at Mimi's because they hassled, you know, Nick and Jimmy, who were supposedly an uncle and a nephew, because nobody knew who James Dean was at that point. You'll see what it's like when a group of guys are getting ready to go to war. Nick had this little wire recorder at the time he had in his jacket. And, you know, a fight almost broke out, and I had to, you know, really shut it down. Nick said, okay, we get the picture. I want you to come out to the studio. He says, I'm gonna give you an office right next to me. He says, I want you to take the script, go through the script. And I'm not rewriting any of Stewart's stuff, obviously. He says, but anything that strikes you strange, just let me know. Just make a note. He says, I want you to select the cars, I want you to select the clothes, and I want you to hang out with Jimmy. And then Jimmy would go to club meetings, hang out with the Athenians.
When Ray began filming at the planetarium, he was filming in black and white CinemaScope. That was because the studio had decided that Rebel was not a prestige film, it was still going to be a B feature.
It was one of the first CinemaScope films they had done.
Nick was unfamiliar with that form, and he said, how the hell do you fill a screen? He said, if you can't really fill it with one head because the screen is horizontal. And if you fill it, where do you put your emphasis?
In the beginning, he was trying to tell Stern, I want to have reality playing against fantasy. So half the screen is going to be real, and the other half is going to be maybe what's going on in the character's mind.
It didn't make sense. Show two levels of consciousness at the same time.
That was, I guess, maybe a feeling that Ray had, that he was not maybe comfortable enough with the medium, but as he started filming and got, you know, behind the camera, he started to be able to fill out that screen and agreed with Stern that the fantasy sequences were unnecessary.
All of us wanted to make this a black and white film because it just asked for it. It would have been much more convincing, we thought.
The lawyers apparently had not read the fine print. In the contract for anybody using CinemaScope, the licensor of CinemaScope said, If you film in CinemaScope, you must also film in color.
The first day of color was a Saturday at Santa Monica High.
I remember when we came in that morning at 6:30 in the morning, struggling in, and they said, "That's it, okay, we're gonna go shoot in color." I went, "You gotta be kidding, nobody's gonna do that."
Because then they changed wardrobe and stuff. We had to, you know,
completely change everything.
The jeans the boys wore all had to be dipped because in Warner color, it would come out green.
Ernie Haller was the cameraman on Gone with the Wind, for God's sake.
We used to get around and have him tell us stories about, you know, shooting during the 30s. It was wonderful having some of these older people that had worked in the industry for so many years on this film. The Chickie Run took place out at the Calabasas Ranch.
On sort of a bluff, it was raised, and they dug tracks in the ground, and they were wooden tracks, and the cars were up on ramps. And so actually when the cars went off the cliff, there was no one in the cars, but the ramp or the catapult or whatever it was started the cars, and the cars went down and went off an embankment. It wasn't really a cliff.
The guy in transportation basically had cars that looked like they were something left over from the dead end kids with rumble seats. I remember hassling with the guy. I says, "No, that's not what these guys drive." And the car that we all loved was a 49 Merc. So I said, "Jimmy should drive the 49 Merc, and we'll just customize it." I was talking to Nick and Jimmy one day, and this knife fight situation came up. My best friend got stabbed, and this guy, you know, does a switchblade on me, and I'm standing there thinking, well, okay, I'm not going to back up. And I pulled my leather jacket over my hand, and what I did is I started boxing, you know, feinting. And I think I hit him with a nice left hook because I could throw a good left hook, and proceeded, you know, to do him in. And Nick said, "Look, what I want you to do is get with Jimmy and Corey and stage it just the way it happened. You know, just the feinting and all that kind of stuff." So if you look at the knife fight, it's a boxing match except two guys have knives.
That scene was very frightening as they were shooting it. It was so intense, you know. I mean, we know it was movies and nobody was really going to get hurt, but you would not have known it by what went on between those two guys. They were powerful together.
He catches Jimmy and actually clips him. And Nick sees that he's been hit with the knife, and he says, "Cut, cut, cut." And Jimmy gets furious and grabs Nick and says, "Don't ever, ever say cut. Don't ever, ever say cut to me. I'll say cut if something's wrong. Don't you ever cut the scene." He really cut me, and like, you know, this is part of the scene, and I want that reality. And was furious and walked off the set, and it took a while before we started shooting again.
The best director I've ever worked with in my life. And I worked with Michael Curtiz and Irving Rapper and just some wonderful people that gave me absolutely nothing.
I think we came up with a lot of it ourselves, although he was so supportive in that.
We had done everything in black and white, and we sat in a projection room, and he showed it to us. He said, "What do you think is wrong?" I said, "It doesn't look like we know each other." And he said, "That's right." He said, "So I want you all to go out tonight and be all together like a gang."
We got together and went out.
We went out
nights.
like in the car and went around driving around like we
You know,
were
we
really
got drunk.
We found an old mansion.
It was sort of like the house in the movie. We all drove in there and laughed and talked and threw rocks and
played games and scared each other. He was the director I ever worked with that let us improvise that way.
Ray liked to work with an ensemble cast. He liked to do ensemble rehearsals. Using his own home,
We used to have Sundays at Nick Ray's place at the Chateau Marmont.
there was a scene in particular where Dean was having trouble with the confrontation scene with his parents, and Dean saw the staircase in Ray's house and said, "That's where we should do the scene." He said, "Yeah, my mother's at the top, my father's at the bottom, and I'm symbolically in the middle." Well, Ray said, "Great." And so he went and he told the set decorator, "I want you to replicate my entire living room, and that's the way we're going to do that scene." Backus described it as a hair-raising experience. They did the shot about 12 or 13 times. On one of those occasions, they actually broke part of the staircase.
I mean, Nick, I have such adoration for so much of what he did. And the way he bowed to Jimmy, the way he seduced that performance out of him by giving him so much room.
Hey, Nick, I never forget, he said, I have an idea, can I do it? Sure, he said. He was lying on the street, and he started, you know, like talking to the monkey, and then he took a piece of the paper and he covered and tucked the monkey in.
And Jimmy, with his brilliance, is tied in the end of the film where he covers Plato with his jacket.
It was a foretelling of how a boy who wants desperately to have a father who will protect him finally realizes that that father exists in himself. To put that together, as Jimmy had to have done, and realize that he could create that nugget at the beginning that would let the audience know what this movie was about without explaining it to them, was some of the most elegant screenwriting that I've ever come across. And, you know, you're really grateful when a director or an actor find those things.
He was like a father that sort of ushered us in and protected us and took care of us.
What Nick would do was he would come over to Jimmy or Natalie or Sal or whoever it was, and he would put an arm around their shoulders, and it was very quiet and very confidential. It was very intense, but very few words. Nick was this powerful presence.
He was very absorbing. You felt ingested when you got through talking to him because he drank you in so much.
The main problem on the set that Ray caused, I think, was the fact that he was having an affair with Natalie Wood, and that Dennis Hopper had apparently walked in on the two of them and was obviously incensed that this man was making love to his girlfriend.
I had a very strange relationship with Nick Ray because I was 18 years old. Natalie Wood and I were having an affair, and Nick Ray was also having an affair with Natalie Wood. So Nick and I got in a lot of fights over that, basically.
Hopper was so mad that he challenged Ray to a fist fight.
And Nick said that, Ray said that he wanted to fire him.
But he was under contract to Warner Brothers. He was going on to Giant, and they weren't going to let him out of that film for anything.
So, but what we can do is take away all of his lines, and he'll just become a guy.
Dennis ends up playing Goon instead of Crunch. But it all worked out the way it was supposed to because the composite energy of all that works.
When we heard that Jimmy had died, we had no idea what was going to happen to the film.
And for a long time, I couldn't watch it without breaking down because it was Jimmy.
And Warner Brothers had Giant and Rebel Without a Cause. Neither of them released, and the star had died.
30 days or less before this movie opened. That was one of the most awful nights of my life.
I know that Jack, Beverly, and myself went to the preview out in Inglewood, and we saw it together. But there was no premiere of Rebel. I went past my high school afterwards, and all the guys were wearing red jackets. So it had a big effect on everyone.
Of course, I believe that Jimmy's death probably had a lot to do with the impact, but also it was the right story at the right time.
If you look at this film now, even though a lot of it is dated, there's a lot that kids can relate to.
The other thing about it that makes it last is the fact that it's a film about teenagers told from the point of view of teenagers.
You know, here's this very violent film, which is not remembered for its violence. It talks about the essential sweetness in every child. That kids come into the world with curiosity, interest, love, and that is all misshapen when it's not responded to. That there is a way of finding a family that is not necessarily your biological one. And this was the beginning of the lateral family. I think that the creation of the family in Rebel Without a Cause was ultimately the creation of the family at Woodstock.